Welcome, everyone. I am Carl Lejwe, Provost here at Stony Brook University, and it is a truly profound pleasure to host this lecture, Why Poetry, by Rowan Ricardo Phillips, the Presidential Professor and Distinguished Professor of English here at Stony Brook. Rowan was born in New York City, grew up in the Bronx, attended Swarthmore for his BA, and his PhD at Brown. He's the author of many, many truly moving works, including 4 books of poetry, Silver, which if it's not by your bedside right now, shame on you, Living Weapon, Heaven, and The Ground. 1 book of literary criticism, When Blackness Rhymes with Blackness, and several books about sports, including I Just Want Them to Remember Me, on Black baseball and American life, and The Circuit, a tennis odyssey. He's been the recipient of many awards, including an Arts and Letters Award for Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a Whiting Award, as well as being twice longlisted for the National Book Award in Poetry. He's the poetry editor of The New Republic. He's truly a beloved professor in the English department, where he teaches graduate and undergraduate courses about literature, poetry writing, creative writing, criticism, and really many other things that have truly captivated our students. His work teaches us that poetry has an incredible power to help us see and understand things differently, to harness the wildly different forces of emotion and language to create something that is uniquely capable of revealing profound truths. We're fortunate to have Rowan at Stony Brook, and he has to stay here forever, and I'm looking at you, Rowan. And I truly believe this is one of our just great human beings here at Stony Brook, one of our great scholars, and someone who creates beauty unlike anyone else. Now, before I bring him up to the stage, I do want to also, I always like to talk about other people in the department, and the English chair, Benedict Robinson. You know, he is one of the truly great chairs here at Stony Brook, and you might not know, he was a character in one of Rowan's poems. What was the name of that poem? I feel like it's at the tip of my tongue, of I or thou. Benedict Robinson, text me if you know. Oh, wait, hold on a second. I'm getting a text. Oh, okay, the mind after everything that has happened. So if you didn't know that, shame on you too, but that's my fault for forgetting it. If you don't know what I'm talking about, trust me, it's hysterical if you did. So with that, we have just an amazing human being and a truly special scholar, Rowan Ricardo Phillips.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thank you, Carl. A special thank you to Carl, the Provost, and David, the Dean, Andrea, the President. Thanks for keeping the lights on. I feel like the lights have been shining brighter here as of late, which is pretty incredible considering everything that's going on. 2 things you should know. One, I'd like to dedicate this to the students and staff, the kind of dual pillars that keep this place being the special place that it is. And also, I'm a devout minimalist, so this is not going to be very long, right? But hopefully it's something we can enjoy. Yes, applause, applause, applause. I have actually given a reading where I've read 2 poems. Yeah, I'm a minimalist, I'm telling you. You won't be so lucky today, especially after such a moving introductions filled with lies. I have to give you a little bit of something. Before I begin, though, one of my colleagues was mentioned. I would also just like to shout out to my colleagues, many of you know them. They are brilliant people, but also incredibly congenial people, and we've been together for quite a long time, and I feel like we're quite a funny family. I love you all. And here I am talking about why poetry. When you title a talk, Why Poetry, you're already in trouble. The phrase doesn't stand still and won't behave. Spoken one way, it's the skeptic's question. Why poetry? What use is it? What difference does it make? Said another way, it's the believer's question. Why poetry? What strange power is it that we keep turning to in moments of wonder or despair, whispered late at night? The words carry awe. Asked in the bright light of morning, they can sound like impatience. Across history, we bear the same wobble, Plato exiling poets as deceivers, Whitman declaring himself the voice of a continent, critics dismissing verse as indulgence, mourners clutching poems as lifelines. The question is old because the uncertainty is old. And every poet, somewhere along the way, has muttered it mid-draft, staring at the page, wondering not just why poetry, but why not plumbing? But mutability goes deeper than tone. The phrase, why poetry, is itself unfinished. Why poetry does what? It's both complete and incomplete, at once a defense of the art and a prompt to continue. And it's precisely in that incompleteness that much of poetry's power resides. Because why poetry can be followed by almost anything, in a way that, for instance, why cooking can't. Why poetry heals. Why poetry wounds. Why poetry lingers when prose forgets. Why poetry embarrasses us. Why poetry sells poorly. Why poetry is dead. Why poetry refuses to die. The stem, why poetry, holds all the branches within it. It's like a tree that keeps sprouting new growth, sometimes tender, sometimes thorned, sometimes a little crooked. The title, then, is not an answer, but an opening. Each generation, each reader writes its own ending to the sentence. In this way, why poetry mirrors itself. It refuses closure, resists finality, stays open to continuation. And here it's worth pausing to think of the great Gwendolyn Brooks's short incantatory poem, We Real Cool. I think you all have it with you. Why don't you take a look at that while I wipe my brow, because I'm spritzing up here. It's very humid. Oi. You could tell I'm from New York when I say, oi, I'm spritzing here. But I am. We real cool. I'm going to read this the way that Gwendolyn Brooks would have read it. The sound of that she syncopates because it's supposed to be a sort of onomatopoeia, the sound of cue balls being just struck constantly as you're in a pool hall. Wah, wah, wah. We real cool. The players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool. We left school. We lurked late. We strike straight. We sing gin. We thin gin. We jazz June. We die soon. Those 7 young pool players use many verbs. They left, lurk, sing, strike, jazz, die. But the most essential verb is absent. Does anyone know what verb I'm talking about? What verb's missing here? To be. We are real cool. Brooks drops it. The poem is all action without being. Not we are real cool, but rather we real cool. And that absence, the absence of being, is everything. It's as if Brooks rewrites the question of questions in English literature. Hamlet's to be or not to be, calm down, Ben, but drops the verb entirely, transforming an individual self-questioning about that same self's existence to be or not to be, to a group mentality spurred on by a fear of missing out, to be or not to be becoming to or not to, which carries only action and no being. For the youths of Brooks' poem, to exist in incomplete sentences is thrilling in its velocity, but fatal in its consequence. Their desire for completeness, for the compulsively filled line, those predicates which power the poem, the finished sentence ends in annihilation. They die soon. And this tension between being and doing, between existence and action, runs everywhere in our culture. Hamlet, as we just talked about, brooded on it, his question collapsing into the barest hinge of words. Descartes took the hinge and fastened it to reason, his cogito, an attempt to prove existence through the act of thought alone. Goethe's Faust was less patient. Thinking was never enough. He longed to act, to enter into contracts, to taste, to touch, to push forward into the realm of where being is tested by deeds. Centuries later, Emerson struck a familiar note in prose that burned like kindling. Life is not intellectual or critical, but sturdy. To him, being required the ballast of labor, of walking the fields, of building and breaking. Ralph Ellison caught the same current in a different register. Hibernation, a definition, a covert preparation for a more overt action, he wrote, describing the quiet intervals of existence that are never still, only waiting, gathering their charge until the moment of escape. Toni Morrison pressed the question deeper still. Freeing yourself was one thing, claiming ownership of that freed self was another. Being in Morrison's vision was never enough. It had to be inhabited, named, acted upon. Otherwise, freedom remained abstract, a ghost untethered to the body. And Derek Walcott, in his meditations on art and fragility, reminded us that even what is shattered endures, that a vase once broken is not erased. Its cracks are proof of its use, its life, its action in the world. Existence for Walcott was not pristine, but marked, scarred, a thing shaped and reshaped by doing. From Hamlet's hesitation to Descartes' logic, from Faust's hunger to Emerson's sturdiness, from Ellison's covert preparation to Morrison's insistence on claiming, to Walcott's fractured vases, the same question keeps surfacing. How do we know we exist, that we're here, except by what we risk, what we break, what we make? The question lingers, alive, across centuries and through us, waiting for each new voice to answer in its own key and with its own tone. But Brooks shows us how that question takes root in the lives of children in her South Side of Chicago, how being and doing are not abstractions, but daily exigencies, urgencies pressed into the cadences of her verse. Through poetry, Brooks shows us the troubling side of that coin, all verb and no being. Poetry comes in here not to solve the tension, but to hold it, to dwell in it. Shout out to Bane from that Batman movie, right? You are in the darkness, I was born in it. Poetry knows this danger, patterns it, and reveals it to us, teaching us to live inside incompleteness, to see that the unfinished is not a flaw, but a truth, that the stem need not always reach for the sun, which leads us to the deeper truth, that poetry survives not by fixing meaning, but by shifting forms. If poetry had always meant the same thing, it would have withered into ritual. And what I mean is this: when a form of language fixes itself to a single purpose, it hardens. Ritual is language repeated until it no longer startles. Ritual words may still move us through habit or faith, but they no longer test the boundaries of our speech. They confirm instead of disturb. If poetry had only remained prayer, only praise, only love song, it would have become a closed form, endlessly repeating its gestures until they emptied of urgency. Poetry survives because it refuses its confinement. It keeps slipping out of its assigned role, reinventing itself, renewing the possibilities of what language can do. That is why it has not withered, why it continues to feel alive, because it changes, because it unsettles, because it refuses to be only ritual. Once it was carved into stone to honor the gods. Once it was sung in fields to steady the rhythm of labor, the rising and setting of the sun, the moving and braying of the wind. Today, it can flash across a screen and still carry the trace of the eternal. Always the same and never the same. A river we enter repeatedly, though its waters change. This mutability of poetry is not weakness, but strength. Other forms of language harden into rules, procedures, transactions. Poetry refuses. It keeps testing the edges of speech. It reminds us that words are not just labels or signals, not just means of buying and selling or giving orders. They are vessels of feeling, of memory, of imagination. They are bridges between inner life and the shared world. That's why poetry is both cherished and feared. It unsettles. It keeps alive the possibility that language can still surprise us, that even the simplest word can be turned until it shines differently. To ask why poetry is to accept this shifting rule, not to pin it down, but to recognize its refusal to be pinned. And here, in the middle of our talking, let's turn to some reading by way of Jorge Luis Borges. In his Parable of the Palace, Borges tells of a poet who visits the emperor's palace, a palace so magnificent it seems to hold the entire world. Hall by hall they walk, chambers of carved jade, courtyards with fountains that sing in 12 tones, libraries where the very arrangement of books is itself an art. The poet says nothing. But when the tour ends, he recites a single poem. It is so perfect, so compact, that it contains the palace itself. The emperor claps his hands in delight. In that instant, the palace vanishes. Only the poem remains. Parable of the palace. On that day, the yellow emperor showed the poet his palace. Gradually, they left behind the long procession of western terraces. Like the tears of an almost boundless amphitheater, they dropped down toward a paradise or garden whose metal mirrors and elaborate junipers borders hinted at the labyrinth. At first, they let themselves get lost, gleefully, as if in a game. Later, they felt some concern, since the labyrinth's straight avenues were gently but inexorably curved. Secretly, they formed circles. Around midnight, observation of the planets and the well-timed sacrifice of a tortoise enabled them to disengage themselves from this seemingly bewitched area, though not from the feeling that they were lost, which clung to them until the end. Presently, they passed through antechambers, patios, and libraries, and then through a hexagonal room with a water clock. One morning, from the top of a tower, they spotted a man made of stone, but he was soon lost to their sight forever. They crossed numerous sparkling rivers in sandalwood canoes, or one river numerous times. When the imperial household passed by, people threw themselves to the ground. One day, they docked at an island where a man failed to do so because he had never beheld the son of the sky, and the executioner was obliged to sever his head. Indifferently, their eyes saw black hair and black dances and complex masks of gold. Reality and dreams became confused, or rather, reality was one configuration of dreams. It seemed the world could not possibly be anything but gardens, ponds, and splendid shapes and buildings. Every 100 paces, a tower pierced the air. In their eyes, they were all the same color, and yet the first one was yellow, and the last one was scarlet. So fine were the gradations, and so long the sequence. At the foot of the next to last tower, the poet, who had seemed removed from the extraordinary sights that so astounded the others, recited the short poem that we now link indissolubly to his name, the composition that, according to the most discriminating historians, brought him immortality and death. The text has been lost. Some say it contained a single line of verse, others of a single word. What is certain, incredibly, is that within the poem was the entire enormous palace, in every detail, every piece of fine porcelain, and every design of every piece, all the shadows and lights of twilight, each and every moment, happy or unhappy, lived by each dynasty of mortals, gods, and dragons that had dwelt there since the farthest reaches of the past. Everyone fell silent, and the emperor exclaimed, "You have stolen my palace." The executioner's iron sword terminated the poet's life. Others tell the story differently. There cannot be two identical things in the world. As soon as the poet recited the poem, they tell us, the palace disappeared as if blasted and swept away by the final syllable. Of course, legends like this are mere fiction. The poet was the emperor's slave and died accordingly. His poems fell into oblivion because that was all it deserved. His descendants are still searching for the word that is the world, but they will not find it. What does this parable tell us? First, that poetry distills, it reduces grandeur to essence, making the fleeting endure, but it also reminds us that there is a cost. In Borges' telling, the palace disappears. The tangible world gives way to the intangible poem. Poetry asks us to trade the solid for the evanescent, the monumental for the memorable, and that's no small trade. There's also risk. The poet in Borges' story vanishes into his own creation, as if perfection could obliterate the maker. To make poetry is to risk yourself, your privacy, your dignity, your past, even your permanence. But that risk is what lends poetry its greatness, its gentleness, its savoir-faire. So why poetry now? Because we live amid an excess of words, more than any generation before us, and yet those words are often thinned of meaning. They rush past in headlines, in slogans, in advertising, in the churn of digital chatter. We have more language than ever, and yet we struggle to trust it. Language today feels like currency in hyperinflation. The more it circulates, the less each unit is worth. Poetry resists this collapse. It slows the circulation. It mints words carefully, one by one, giving them weight. In a time when language is squandered, poetry makes words scarce again, and therefore precious. And here's the sly paradox. In a world drowning in words, poetry survives by asking for less. Not thousands of words, just a few. Not a torrent, but a drop distilled, one drop strong enough to change the bloodstream. And, as with a strong drink, moderation is wise. No one ever said a 100-page poem saved a party. This is no small service. For when language collapses into noise, so does thought. And when thought collapses, so does recognition. The ability to see ourselves and to see others clearly. Poetry resists that collapse. It holds open a space where words can once again be trusted, where they can carry truth, where they can make human lives intelligible to one another. In fractured times, this is not luxury, but necessity. Poetry does not provide solutions or policies, but it gives us an orientation. It steadies us by showing that language can still bear meaning, that a small flame can last even in a gale. And so, we come to the enduring truth. For all its shifting roles, one thread runs through poetry. It allows us to recognize each other. To encounter a poem is to hear another voice, sometimes centuries old, sometimes close at hand, saying, "I felt this. I saw this. I endured this. And in that instant, the private becomes shareable, the isolated, communal. Recognition flickers. We realize we are not alone. It doesn't matter whether the subject is grief or joy, a field of flowers, or a battlefield. What matters is that what seemed incommunicable has been communicated. What matters is that poetry lets us see not only the world, but the person trying to name it. Recognition is not an ornament of life, but its fabric. And here, if you'll forgive the plainness, is the wonder. One person speaks, another listens. And suddenly, a bridge is built between them. A bridge made of nothing but air and syllables, yet somehow sturdier than stone. There's a greeting in Zulu, Sawubona, I see you. But it means more than that. It means, by seeing you, I bring you into being. And the response is Sekona, I am here. I exist because you have seen me. It is not merely a polite exchange, but an affirmation of worth, a recognition that existence is communal. And it is also resistance. To say Sawubona is to refuse the violence of erasure, to insist that no one's life is invisible, no one's presence dispendable. Poetry at its best is our Sawubona, I see you, and in reading, in listening, in answering, we reply, Sekona, I am here. So why poetry? Because it creates that recognition. Because it takes what is most fragile and fleeting and makes it durable. Because it allows us to say to one another, I see you. And that is why the candle burns. And this is where that candle belongs. When the world darkens, poetry is that candle carried into the room. It does not cure the dark. It does not rebuild what is broken, but it allows us to see one another's faces. And from that recognition, face to face, Sawubona and Sekona, everything else can begin. And that, in the end, is why poetry. Thank you.
Academic says they're going to be brief, it's usually an apology for planning not to be brief, but you actually accomplished it. But I knew you would do that, so we're not going to let you get away with that.
Well, I was on the fence about reading the Borges, but it's too good to pass up. So
sometimes in academia we start at the end. So let's start at the beginning. What was your first memory of poetry?
My first memory of poetry, and this is going to sound so from central casting, but it's actually true, is my mother's recitations of Shakespeare. I'm somebody who grew up with their mother always reciting Shakespeare, and I realize now in retrospect, she wasn't like a bot, just kind of walking around going, to be or not to be, or, thou nature, my goddess, but it was like everything had a context. So she had passages of Shakespeare for whatever way that I messed up, or did good, or messed up, or messed up, or messed up. And I found myself constantly amazed, not just by the beauty, but by her capacity for recall and for the aptness of it. That there were these rhythmic patterns that called me out. And that was kind of the power and the glory of the thing. And that also just mixed with the music in my life. I was just surrounded by music. My parents, of course, growing up in the Bronx in the 70s and 80s, and just lots of every type of music. And I didn't grow up, Carl, with this type of sense of like, this is music and this is poetry, or this is somebody speaking to you and there's a poem that you're reading. And so it all kind of got mixed into the same matrix. Because the Shakespeare, for instance, most people get Shakespeare in a book. I was just getting it recited. When I was 10, my uncle got me a complete works of Shakespeare with no footnotes. So I was just kind of reading the stuff, blind stick. And I think, though more, Carl, that there's not recognition of the poetry in you, but more, we're all born like this. There's this valve that we shut off because, we don't want to get beat up. We don't want to walk around saying poems all the time, but we're all born thinking of rhythm and patterns, right? We have elemento as a letter, right? Because of the way that we learn by song, and we're always, as kids, no one here first learned anything in the world that wasn't through rhythm and rhyme. It's the poetry that introduces us to the world, and then it's the socialization that we get after that kind of tamps it down. But we really do have that all in us, whether our mother's reciting Shakespeare when we mess up or not.
So what was her favorite poem of yours?
I think a poem in silver, I would say, Prelude, which is an elegy for my grandmother, who passed away March 19th, 2021. And I think that's her favorite poem. She hasn't told me this, but I think it's her favorite poem because that's a poem no one else could write, and someone had to write it. I feel that way about all of my poems, but I think that poem kind of dramatizes for her in that moment what that feels like to me. That there's a poem, and if I don't write it, it's not going to get written, and it really needs to be written. But I can tell you, I gave the first poetry reading my mother came to, the only poetry reading that my mother came to. My first book came out, and there was a poem in there like a lot, and there are a few F-bombs in there, and they're not kind of like punk rocky, I'm just here dropping F-bombs for the sake of it, F-bombs. I thought they were really thoughtful, well-placed, academic F-bombs. And so, I read a bunch of other poems, and then I after I'm done, my mom comes up. My mom's a West Indian woman. She's like, good. And I'm like, oh, you enjoyed it, Mom? She's like, yeah, but we should talk about, you use the language there. You dropped a few F-bombs. I proceed, Carl, to explain to my mother why they were there and their function and what I was looking to do. And she just she basically didn't put her index finger to my lips to shut me up, but she's basically looking at me like, I know what you were trying to do. You need to take those out. So one thing is the poem my mother responds to the most, and the other is I have a poem in my first book where my mother was the editor, not my book editor. And I took those out, I changed effed up to messed up, and I told her, you get one edit, Mom, and that's your edit. So you see how your mom could be both your great inspiration, but also your kind of great hatchet person, right, on the case.
Have you dropped any F-bombs in reading since then?
I have
We have
not.
our answer.
I have not.
Okay,
I have not. Good for the power of the mother, right?
So,
I love that question.
coming back to favorites, what's your favorite poem of yours? And I think it's really interesting. You read 2 poems today and did not read yours.
Yeah.
I'm going to come back to that later, but right now, what's your favorite?
I don't have a favorite poem, Carl. I have a completely non-hierarchical mind. They're like my kids. They all have their function. I kind of don't. My favorite poem is the next one that I'm going to write. They all do something for me. They all kind of came out of responses to your reading. All your writing is residue of your reading. So I really, and I just I don't have bests or favorites. If you ask me who the goat was, I would say there's a billy goat somewhere here on a farm. But I just don't have favorites. I guess I'm kind of like that musician who doesn't like, I don't want to play my most popular track, right? I can tell you that question's making me think about the fact that people respond differently in terms of what their favorite poem is. And in that sense, I think I'm doing something right, or at least it makes me happy, that I'm not somebody who has that one poem where people are saying, could you read that poem again? And I'm like, the woman at the start of Titanic, it's been 84 years, I'm still reading the same poem. And that to me is proof of concept, But yeah, I don't have a favorite, and I prefer it that way.
Okay. You said something about you don't have a hierarchical mind, and that really resonates with me for other things that I've heard you say, where you don't believe you have any more authority or expertise on poetry than the student in your class who's hearing it for the first time. And so I often like to ask people, if you were to think about when you started a job, why are you better at it today than when you started? But I'm going to ask you the opposite question. In what way are you a worse poet today than you were the very first poem you wrote?
Oh, in so many ways. In so many ways. I think you end up, I have a lot of students in my head all the time. I mean, you can't end up being, I'm a worse artist because I have more people and the stakes that they have very present in my mind when I'm teaching. And I think that makes me a worse artist, but in a good way, in a necessary way, because encountering kind of the debilities that you have in art, or the lack of space that you have to make art, also empowers your humility. And humility is one of the great engines that you have in making. It's really hard for me when I'm teaching during a semester to listen to the poems that are popping into my head. That's how they come. They just kind of come as these kind of like, these trespassers in my head. But I tend to push those back, and I don't write much as I'm teaching, because I think that the students need that space. They don't know whether they have it or not, but I do. And you can't, of course, the less time you spend on your art, in certain ways, the worse you are at it, but at the same time, in certain ways, you're much better at it. Some writers that I really admire, like Elizabeth Bishop, really needed to take extended time off from it. And the ways in which I'm a worse writer makes me, I think, in the long term, a stronger writer, because I understand myself more from teaching, and I kind of understand the stakes, I think, that are involved in a much more nuanced and interpersonal way. And that, I think, in the long term, in the long game of poetry, is a good thing. You get better by being worse. It's almost like a vaccine, right? And I feel really heartened by that.
Yeah. So one thing I was really struck in listening to you today is the way in which poetry feels protected from mistruths and lies and manipulation. And no one ever wrote a poem to tell you that vaccines cause autism.
Right.
It's very, seems protected
Yet,
in
Carl,
that way.
yet.
So why is that?
Sing to me, muse. Well, there's certain ways in which poetry is completely off the grid in terms of its relation to late capital. And for that way, it's kind of protected in a way in that it doesn't get, it's not kind of swept up in the slings and arrows of profit. I don't think it's protected in its moment, because poetry is, pilloried, mocked, disparaged in ways that we all know. It is protected in its relationship with time, which is unique. It outlives and outlasts not just all of us, but most other forms of art. And so in certain ways, poetry doesn't need our own protection. It doesn't need our protection because its survival is proof of concept, but it certainly needs our complicity. We need to be present to poetry, or we miss the opportunity to be a part of it. I'm hard-pressed to think of a civilization that's not remembered through its poetic arts. And for that reason, I think we'd be best off getting on the train so that we're remembered. We do a lot of things, we buy a lot of things, we participate in a lot of things, and because we spend money on them, or lots of people use them, we presume that there's a value to them. But I think we've been shown that permanence, kind of in our idea of existing in the long game, comes through ways of experiencing the world that have endured. And poetry's front and center in that kind of long song, that journey of endurance.
So you talked a lot about students and a lot of thought into where you are and where they are and really being there present with them. And we always think about what did the students learn from you, but because of the way you talk about things, you make me wonder other questions than I would normally ask. And so in this case, I want to ask you, what have you learned from your students?
Ooh, I mean, I think really kind of to reduce everything down to why. I thought of my students when I titled this talk. Why poetry? I love my students here because they ask the essential questions. Why is this? What is this? Can I do this? Can I live with this? Can I be me and accepted as me if I give myself to this? I've had some very real conversations with students who are in a very complicated space just from deciding, you choose to study this, you choose to spend these months together with this. And I learned that from that, you have to always look at poetry as something that's very raw. I always look at poems, the poems I read, they're always very alive to me. It's like I've never read them before. And that happens a lot with students, and I always make a point of, if not mirroring, just remembering what that's like, and also what initial questions there are to things. And I've learned also different strategies for the ways in which old art can sound new, because their point of reference is not going to be necessarily my point of reference. So they teach me different angles of ascent and points of entry into art, which are incredibly necessary kind of parts of being. I learned from them patience with the work. And I also just want to come back to the sense of stakes as well. You know, I think that our students who study the arts are very brave and very righteous, and that there are a lot of stakes involved with that. There's certain things that you can study and feel like you've been thrust on a path that's not your own, but you know what it is, right? And with poetry, the path, unless you follow the Virgilian path, is not defined in that way. It's foggy, it's winding, but it's cool as hell. You know, there are lots of nouns along that path, but the goal, as we were talking about with We Real Cool, is to be a verb. You know, I'm reminded of Big Daddy Kane, someone I loved listening to as I grew up with. Big Daddy Kane in Raw, so full of action, my name should be a verb. We should aspire to that, right? So that we shimmer and become verb, pure verb. But that comes as we encounter nouns, right? My students, when they begin, our semesters are often nouns that kind of like radiate into beautiful verbs. And I love that. And watching them, observing them, going through that process with them, you always learn. So
I think about all the different areas that you write in. I mean, obviously you're known for poetry, but what you've done with your sports writing, with commentary, with editing, so this isn't a verb, right? But how do you keep balance, and what are the ways in which you stay true to sort of the essence of who you are as a poet, but also manage to go in and out of these different areas and have such an impact, but then always seem to know how to come back?
Well, you, with the fate of a university on your shoulders and the need to balance things constantly, think about balance differently than I do. I don't feel balanced at all. And I just kind of live with it, right? You just kind of see all these levers going up and down and up and down. And it's less balance and more kind of like undulations that I ride. It's kind of a wild wave that I ride. I think it helps that I don't think of myself as a poet. I'll be surprised. You all can check the audio, but I don't think I've even called myself a poet in this talk. I find it to be such a sacred, it's just such a sacred thing. I want, when I die, for someone to call me a poet, and I'll be happy with that. But I don't feel like I get to call myself a poet. I'd rather make poems and kind of see what happens with that. That's a form of balance, I think, because it just kind of keeps me humble. And instead of looking for balance, I look for kindness, I have to say. I'm of an age where the generation before me, I think, really kind of honed in on this sense of like, to be a real artist, you've got to be a real enfant terrible, which is French for asshole. And there's a real privileging of just being a jerk. You know what I mean? Like, my way or the highway in the classroom, my way or the highway in the office meeting, my way or the highway on the page, my way or the highway at the bar, right? And I've really found this beautiful turn now in my generation where people realize you have to be kind. And you have to also practice wellness. I talk to my students about being well, hydrating, and things like that. Our search for kindness doesn't necessarily give us balance, but it's kind of a journey worth following. And if I can have kindness without balance, I'll take it. Hopefully I can have both, but you'll show me the way to that someday, man.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, I see the balance in the long game. I never see it in the moment.
Yeah.
And you've talked about the long game a few times.
Yeah.
Can you go into that a little bit more?
Well, I always say the long game is the only game that you can really get tripped up by short-term thinking, with poetry in particular, but writing in general. You have to think about the life of art and how poetry predates your intention. You can intend to write on something, but poetry will guide you into what you're really going to write about. And in the same way, kind of what we're destined to be and do, that only kind of gets worked out in kind of the vapor trail of having done and having been. So I'm really always thinking in a moment to do the right thing, as Spike has reminded us to do, and trust the process. I'm not very balanced, but I'm very process-oriented. I am very much a trust the process person, and I like to think about how things work out after a long period of time. I think teaching is a really incredible allegory for that, because you come in and you see students who know very little about something, and at the end they know quite a bit. Or you see students at the beginning of a semester and you think this student's going to be a pain in my tuchus, and in the end they're the most wonderful being you could ever imagine, right? You see students when they come in at 17 or 18, and then you see them when they're 21, 22, 23, or 24. And so you really have to have patience, I think, with just kind of being in this phenomenological world and playing the short game, especially with poetry. Playing the short game with poetry is just kind of like being the walking dead. You have to think about things in this kind of long sweep. It's like I had said that writing is the residue of your reading. You can write a poem without reading. You can't write poetry without reading, right? Like, poetry is this different thing from a poem. Poetry is this kind of, It's this throb. It's this intention. It has diastolic and systolic pressure. A poem can have those things, but it's much more kind of a moment. It's the short game. And poetry is the long game, right? It's kind of, I have kids, and it's kind of like that with your kids. There are moments when you can respond to something in the short game, but you really need to pause and think about how that ties into the long game, something I'm studying now. 13 and 10, so yeah.
So you're part of a group of great faculty here at Stony Brook that remind people that Stony Brook is a great liberal arts university. When you think about the different ways the arts and the humanities and social sciences contribute to that, in many ways, there's a focus on what is a good life and what does that mean. What does that mean to you, and why is that? I know that's something important to you with students. Why is that so important to you?
Well, because we study the humanities to learn how to be citizens, right? You look at any of the finest universities in this country, and there's a strong focus, not just in the humanities, but in the study of English literature. That includes at MIT, Caltech, Georgia Tech. We have to think about, I'd mentioned something from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, a covert preparation for more overt action. Well, your time studying is this covert preparation, right? What happens overtly, what happens after, that's the life. In a way, our time here, we're living, but at the same time, we're kind of gesticulating. And my importance to my students feels, I think, to them like the short game. Do I understand this? Did I turn this in on time? Did I get a good grade? But I'm thinking about their development in the long game. And that doesn't mean did they get a good job. Chances are the job that you get when you graduate is not going to be the only job that you have. I'm not worried about that. I'm more worried about you take care of yourself? Do you pay things forward? Do you know the difference between repetition and increment? Do you pinwheel on regret instead of using it as a way to target good intentions? Are you driven by intention or impulse? Do you know the difference between the two? These things all come off as lecturing by an old person if you're not careful, but what's wonderful about poetry is that it's all there in beautiful, rhythmic, and really kind of amazing scenarios that we can talk about. And oftentimes in a literature course, it's the only situation where you're together with your peers and anyone above the age of 21 and talking about things you care about, things you like, right? How you feel about something. That's a responsibility that I take seriously, but also try to have fun with it. And you'd mentioned my colleagues. I've learned a lot from them about teaching. We've all got kind of different temperaments and different approaches to being in the classroom, being on the page, and also being with each other. And you live, and you learn, and you grow. And I feel like we've all kind of grown together. One thing I really like in a class is getting this sense of, this person studied with Celia. This person studied with Ben. This person studied with Ken. This person studied with Amy. This person studied with Susan. I love that. This person studied with Anisha. When you lean in and you listen, you can hear. And you also hear them talking about the colleagues as well. At the end of class today, someone left and was extolling a colleague and said they were their favorite. I was happy, but also really jealous and upset. I'm going to fail that student, but we don't have to get into that. We don't have to get into that now.
So when a student gives me a disapproving look on campus, I'll know they studied with Celia?
Yes. They're dressed like a flapper and giving you a disapproving look. Yes, that's Celia's student.
So I feel like something that you're really good at, I've never heard you say this, is your intuition, not about what people want, but what they need. And the reason I say that is very personal for me. So We were in my office one day, and I had told you a story about my father, and I have a very complicated relationship and history with my father. And to be honest, I'm not even sure that that story was real. It was something that my mother had told me, and I sort of remembered it, or maybe I don't know where it came from, but I believed it to be true. And I told you about this because it was related to baseball, and I told you that my father had played in the Pan American Games and was a pitcher. And
Lefty, right?
he was a lefty. That was his nickname. And you wrote back to me later, and I was half sure you were going to tell me it wasn't true because I just had all these different things in my head. And you took the time to find out about him. And for me, when you sent me all that, I had memories of my childhood that I had sort of blocked out because I focused on a lot of different things, but it was something I needed somebody to tell me how important that was. And the time you took to do that, I don't know how or why you knew to do that, but you just knew what I needed in that moment. And I feel like reading your poetry since then, when I look at it, I look at your great ability to know what society needs. And I know you're too humble to answer this question well, but I just want you to know that meant a lot to me, and I'm fairly certain that impacts a lot of people. So do you want to ruin the question with a humble, overly humble answer, or?
Well, first I'm going to say, what the hell? We're having a private conversation, and now you're telling everybody our stuff. I can't trust you, man. I'm thinking we're having a conversation, the two of us, and you just put it all out here. What else have you told people?
All of it.
So listen, man, it's one of these things where, this happens in poetry. You had the feelings, you had the sensations. You didn't need more information until you had it. And then you needed it. And poetry teaches you need what you need when you need it. That Gwendolyn Brooks poem, We Real Cool. We don't have to talk about annihilation or them dying soon. We could talk about the pleasure of them being together. We real cool. Hell yeah, people in Chicago talk like that. We real cool, we skip school, we do all this stuff. These are my dogs, and you celebrate that. And then at another point in your life, you come to this other layer of it. Where's the verb to be? Vit avec l'être, right? Sacré-bleu, right? And then we talk about death and morality and things like that. But poems, what we had was a poem. And the layers of intention and meaning. You had, Carl, what you needed from that kind of node of experiences and relation with your father until you needed more. And I like metaphor, right? Metaphor comes from Greek. It means transport. I was just the transport for that. Right? And that's what I think happens with poetry. It is the key that you need when you need it. You needed a key for the back door up until when we had that conversation. Then after that, you had a key for the front door. You still have the key for the back door. Sometimes you go through the back, right? Yeah. And what we do, I think, when we're teaching literary art is giving our community kind of that. Keys to the front door, keys to the back door, keys to the car, hopefully keys to the other car as well. And different ways in. I talked about angles of ascent and points of entry. Now you have another one. But we were having a really human moment there, and I was moved and I wanted to know more. That's my temperament. I wanted to know more, and then I wanted to share.
So I'm going to take those keys and I'm going to hand them to the audience. So if you have questions, please come up to one of the two microphones and we will transition.
Hi, my name is Amina. I'm a student of yours currently. Hi, how are you? Hi. So you spoke a bit about the difference between poetry and poems, or writing poetry and writing poems, and I always thought they were one and the same. So I'm curious, how can you tell when a writer is writing poetry or just writing a poem, or how can a writer see that, in what they're writing?
Well, Amina, first I want to say that I love how present that you are in our class. And I know that you sometimes, I'll even go as far as say often say, am I talking too much? You're never talking too much. And I'm so glad to see you here with this type of question. It's a wonderful question, and the answer comes from reps. I won't necessarily see a poem and go, ha, this is a poem, but it is not poetry. But what happens with art is you want to live with it again and again, right? So a poem that speaks to you, oh, give me that again. Give me that again. Let me hear it again. And if it continues to live with you, then it's operating on a level of poetry. If it starts to lose something, right, then perhaps it's operating more on the level of a poem. But it's one of these things, honestly, and I do mean this honestly, it's not one of these things that, like, you should chase down in youth. You should not know the difference between a poem and poetry. You should just get it all down. Poetry is, I think, a commitment to the long game. I was always making poems, but I got interested in knowing about the history of the art, right? Its past and its possibilities for the future. That to me is kind of poetry, this human chain, right? The poem is the thing that you're making that has these stanzas and different types of schemes and intentions that we've been talking about, and clauses and all of that. And once you start to take them apart the way that we do at 361, you're talking about poems, right? It's like my dad once with his friend, they went into the friend's garage because they loved cars. My dad still loves cars. And they took apart the engine of my dad's friend's car. That's what we're doing in classes, right?
Yeah.
They didn't know how to put the engine back together. And when my friend's dad came home, there was trouble. So what we're learning how to do is take them apart and put them back together. That taking things apart and putting them back together, treating something like an object, that's the poem. But when we're talking about larger implications, when we're talking about I Felt a Funeral in My Brain by Dickinson or Whitman, or what we did with Lucille Clifton, all that is the poetry of it. But it's really just a question of reps and living with something long enough so that it's both a thing. This is a 16-line poem made up of 4 quatrains, but it's also an essence, right? And when it's an essence, then you can talk about its metaphorical qualities and such like that. But it's the journey with the art that will get you to kind of like see and feel that. Inevitably, you will reach a moment where you look at your poems and go, okay, how are these talking together? And that's when you'll start talking about your poetry. Poem to poem, you're talking about your poems. But the most important thing, know it's there. Yeah. Don't worry about it.
Gotcha.
Right now. Okay? And that's something we can continue to talk about if that wasn't helpful.
No, that was
or
beautiful.
clear.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
I'm a doctoral student here. And my question is actually about your process of editing and revising and how it's either similar or different and I'm curious here if you could, I guess selfishly, because I'm a doctoral student, if you could reflect maybe on your time in grad school as well and how like your process, like I said, is similar or different when you're working on a piece of criticism or a piece of academic writing versus when you're writing creatively.
Yeah. When you talk about revision, are you talking about poetry, prose, or both?
Both.
Okay. So they're different. With poetry, it's very much oral. And I tend to read out loud. And anytime there's a change, even if it's that and which, or and the, I just keep writing the poem. So I write the poem again and again and again and again until it repeats itself. For instance, I can't call you Mary. That's not your name. It would be strange to you. When you write a poem enough, it torques into what it wants to be, and you can't make it something else, So that's the process with poetry. With prose, there's There's also a lot of kind of like reading out loud, but there's also questions of kind of how do you get into it? How do you get out of it? Does it have parts to it? Do I begin with a question? I almost always, with a piece of prose, remove the ending and the conclusion. And I see what it looks like without those, so that you begin with the second and you end with the penultimate. I almost always also will take my conclusion and put it at the top. So I'm very much like moving paragraphs around to see how they hit. And the prose I always read out loud, even if it's not something that I know that I'm going to share. Grad school was funny for me. I have a PhD in English literature, and I went to grad school in the 90s. So if anybody here went to grad school in the 90s, you'll know that it was like Game of Thrones, because you had English over there, and you had creative writing over there, and you had like dragons and ice lakes in between, and fights. Those of you who don't know, maybe a couple of people maybe were here, but this place was actually famous in the 90s for like fights in the culture wars, and people would like shiv people when they walked down the hall. It was like an episode of Oz. It was very, you think I'm exaggerating? I am not. And so I was in the English department. I very much knew I wanted to write, but I wanted to write a dissertation. I had serious, long questions about the study of poetry, and I knew that that type of study would suit me really well. I have an archival temperament, so I wanted to kind of be in the libraries and get lost in them. And my dissertation advisor was a poet, the great poet Nicolás Harper. His office was basically just a treasure trove of, I mean, what would you call it? Just kind of like manuscripts and texts that nobody had seen and letters that nobody had seen. It was basically like his office was a rare library of rare manuscripts. And I got to live and dwell in all of that. I couldn't take any creative writing courses. I got kicked out of one on the first day by my dissertation advisor. It was a lot of fun in front of everyone. And so I really had a sense of stakes. I went to graduate school not because I wanted to be a professor. I went straight out of undergrad, so I was 21. I finished when I was 27. I wanted to learn this stuff. And I knew that when I was done, you know, my folks always taught me, like, if you're curious and you know stuff, somebody will hire you and teach you stuff. And so I felt like with a doctorate in English literature and all the training that I did, and I wasn't going to be 75 when I left, I would have a lot of answers to things that I wondered about, and spending time with people who also loved these things. And then I would take it from there, which is why I never stressed out about qualifying. You should never stress out about qualifying exams. Honestly, it's like, go away for 6 months, read all this stuff that you're supposedly really interested in, and then sit with 3 experts and talk about it. Nobody else wants to talk to you about your stuff, folks. They do. That should be like really awesome. So go away and study and do it, right? But there are all these other things that go into being a student that make it very fraught. I get it. But I loved it a lot. And speaking of trust the process, it was just one of those things that kind of like, you know, the studying went well, the dissertation was going well, and step by step kind of led to this process where, you know, next thing I know, I was in New Orleans with you. I'm like, Dorothy, you were there, and you were there, and you were there. And then next thing you know, I'm here. But I had questions, and I worked as hard as I could to answer them. And I took the resources here, whether it was the fellow graduate students or faculty, as being kind of part of that journey, that we're kind of curious about things, and that it's a great degree to have. It's a doctorate that predates the MD, if that needs saying. I was prepared for whatever came after. And I think that if you have a sense of that, if you let go of the market and just say, I'm here to write. I was here to be the best student I could be in the years I took classes, and then I was going to kind of like kick ass in qualifying because that was the next thing to do. And then when I was ABD, I just gave everything to this thing. I had these questions. You know, you learn the things when you're writing a dissertation. You need to go to a bar and meet somebody who has no idea about anything you're studying, and really say like, yeah, I'm doing this. in a sentence, and they don't get up and be like, oh, okay. Then you know you're onto something. And kind of let the rest happen. It's not as easy as I'm making it sound, but I think a lot of it's about just faith and kind of understanding the process and trusting it. And also with revision in the grad process, I would also just say finding some people who you know who are good readers among your cohort. If you find some people who you know are good readers, vibe with them and just share stuff. It does not matter if their stuff has nothing to do with yours. It's probably even better. And just vibe and share texts and stuff like that. Find critics that you're absolutely over the moon about and model your writing after them. And also just know how different academic presses, what they tend to put out. So Yale University Press, Hopkins, UVA, whatever university press, MIT, which has a wonderful press, by the way. And just have a sense of kind of like the different temperaments of the presses and take it from there.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Hope that helps.
Hi, I'm Madison.
Hi, Madison.
Also a current and former student of yours. And something that you mentioned that stuck out to me was when you talked about language as a currency, and that like the heightened weight that poetry in particular holds because of how carefully you have to choose your language.
Wow, what a good listener.
And I'm wondering what your thoughts are and how that is unique to poetry in the current era of epistemic violence that we're facing right now in terms of censorship and language as a weapon. And how do you feel that poetry specifically has a role in this culture war that we're currently experiencing?
Well, it's wonderful to think about that. I mean, I'd look no further than we talked about kind of poetry's role in late capitalism. Jimmy Kimmel was just taken off the air, and he's still off the air in 20% of households in this country. That's not going to happen to poetry. So poetry has a way in which it is off the grid in ways that I think are can be radical and righteous. And that's a power. So the thing that sidelines poetry is also, I think, its superpower, that it's sidelined. This is what leads to great communal action, whether it's Sonia Sanchez's poem about the Move tragedy from 1985, or if it's Ginsberg getting together with everybody and reading Howl in public and being charged with indecency in San Francisco. But when you are sidelined, you have something wonderful happen, which is that you get to nudge your way back to the middle. And that type of work, I think, is unique to poetry because it has, inarguably, it has an essential place, I think, in our culture, even by the way that people look to kind of fight it or dismiss it. What are you fighting for? If it doesn't need to be dismissed, if it's not all that, it doesn't need to be dismissed or mocked. But because of that, it has this particular positionality, which means that in these moments that you're talking about, which are chronic and systemic, it can awaken itself and awaken others by finding its way, fighting its way back to the middle. Sometimes that works through public poetry and civic poetry. Sometimes it absolutely does not, and it has to be handled more in kind of the shadowy realms, the more shadowy realms of discourse. But I think that this is what we're trying to figure out now, how to live with poetry in this age of late capital, right? We've tried to think about it as digital currency, which kind of like happened and then didn't happen. And we've seen the way in which poetry has been codified via TikTok and Instagram and everything like that, which has been powerful. But I think that poetry's specific power, you see this in theater too, but theater necessarily has to be tied up with profit, or at least with expense in a certain way that poetry doesn't. But I think that both poetry and theater both have this positionality where they move from the side to the center, which is powerful and necessary. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And I know that you also do theater, so that's wonderful. I think you should think about those two as really being, as they've always been, as being kind of like twin engines in this fight that we're undertaking, which is a long and uncertain fight. But I'm glad you're here and fighting the good fight, Madison.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hey.
Hey.
My name's Mary.
Hi, Mary.
And I'm a faculty member in the School of Marine and Atmospheric Science. And this is my daughter, Gwen, and my parents are in the back. So this was a family affair. Gwen wanted me to ask a question. So, one of the things that occurred to me as you were talking was sort of how art intersects with science and how that intersects with things like grand environmental challenges that we have at the moment. And there's a lot of people that talk about the importance of art, whether it be, painting or poetry or language. And could you talk a little bit about your experience with, these types of challenges that we face, whether they be, the things I think about like climate issues or things that Stony Brook has really tried to participate in and says that they're going to participate in, whether it be the climate exchange or other climate initiatives. But I mean, those are things that are close to what I do and what I care about and how I think about, the future. But is there anything you've worked on that you feel applies to that? Or do you have any comments about how these things can play together to try and express feelings or express truth. And I would just like there to be ways to, work together, basically.
Well, first, Gwen, give me 5. Good for you. Good on you. Fist bump. Good on you for being here. I appreciate you. And that's a great question. Mary, it's awesome that you're here. You all call Mary because your name is Mary. That you're here is kind of so awesome and kind of so typical of this place and, what we are at our best. I'll tell you the longest poem that I've written and published. It's in Poetry Magazine. It's called Child of Nature. It's in my last book of poems, Silver. And it's all, it's about the Anthropocene, and it's also about our sense of what nature is, the ontology of nature. I take William Wordsworth's Tim Turned Abbey, and I basically keep the last word of each line. But I write my own poem about coming back to New York after the pandemic and what it's like thinking about nature and the sublime and the natural sublime and ecological threat when you're from a place like the Bronx, right? And the role that urban spaces play in our understanding of nature. I consider an urban space to be a spot of nature as well, particularly in 2025. We have, and I think just kind of like central to poetry's ontology is this sense of ecology, right? I mean, we could go back to the Georgics, the land, our relationship to the land, and what we've done to the land. This actually ties into something, Mary, I was teaching on Tuesday about witness. We were talking about poetry of witness. And I think that, I was going to say contemporary poets, but I think that this has actually been a wonderful consistency among poets, this sense of bearing witness to ecology, both its sublimity and also the terrible threat that it's constantly under. Marianne Moore has a wonderful poem called The Fish, and it's an incredible poem in part because there are no people in it. There are no people in it. But there's a moment where it basically says there are no people here, but they're the signs of people, and they're axe grooves, hatchet grooves, dynamite blasts. So in this really peaceful, meditational portrait of the ocean, while there are no people there, there's still signs of the effect, like the vapor trail. And I've always thought that that's also a wonderful moment to show students the way that poets think about ecology, and they won't call it out, but that if you look really closely at the picture that they've drawn, they're talking about what we're doing to the natural world. So I'm very easy to find. Let's talk and team teach something, right? I think that would really be kind of part of what makes Stony Brook awesome. What you do and what I do, we often will have students in separate classes, but wouldn't it be awesome to get students together and think about this as kind of like a big picture thing?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So let's do it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Mary's mom and dad, thanks for coming.
Okay, so as we close down, the last question is, it's the end of your career, and somebody writes about you. You ended up at Stony Brook because it was the job that was open, but you stayed your whole career.
I had other offers, Carl.
It was a job that was open, but you stayed your whole career because?
I love the people here. I really do. I love the people here. I love my colleagues. I love the students. And I feel that the people here who are currently making the school go have their hearts and heads in the right place. I love it here. The door's been opened before, but I love it here. I've visited a lot of other places. There's no place like this. You really don't realize that until you visit other places. But there's no place like this place. I love teaching poetry here because the students, you all ask questions and you think, well, I've just got this question. But they're really beautiful and unvarnished questions. They're really questions about like, I want to understand this stuff. I want to understand this. And I love that because there's another way of being at a university and teaching poetry where everybody reads the stuff you're supposed to read at that institution, and everybody says what the professor wants to hear, and then everybody goes about their business. But I feel like here we all kind of, like New Yorkers, we live elbow to elbow, and we learn about each other, I think, in ways that's real. And I love that. I'm interested in being a real person and living a real life, you know, not a plastic one. And I feel like I'm living a real life here with you all. That makes me really happy.
So we will all keep writing the poem, Why Stony Brook?
Yes, why Carl? Why Carl?
Maybe not.
Put a comma in there. Why, comma, Carl? Why, Carl? Why, Carl? Thank you so much, Carl. Thank you. All you wonderful people back there that nobody can see, thank you. And thank you. I love you all. Please don't be strangers, okay? To each other or to me. I'll see you soon.